Good afternoon, everyone. My name is the Filipino White Boy, and today I'm going to be going over my settings for Ace Combat 5 and 0 in the PCSX2 emulator. Now, before I begin, I just want to preface by saying that these settings are really only applicable if you are an if you are an NVIDIA user. If you are an AMD user, I recommend another YouTuber by the name of Tuga Avenger. He did a very good video on tutorial on how to set up Ace Combat for the PCSX as well. And his settings are really best for those who have an AMD card. He is an AMD user himself. But with that out of the way, let's begin. I'm going to go over my emulation settings first. I have left the first three settings here as is. There is no need to deal with them. I've set my aspect ratio to fit window/screen, the GS window settings. And I've also checkmarked wait for VSync on refresh. If you have a monitor that is capable of higher refresh rates, for example, I have an MG248Q gaming monitor, which is capable of 144 Hz refresh rate. If you have a monitor that's capable of similar refresh rates, I highly recommend playing Ace Combat with the higher refresh rate, as it leads to an increase in frame rate as well as smoother frame rate. And lastly, of course, you just want to make sure that you check wait for VSync on refresh. With my speed hacks, I have enabled everything except fast C DVD, which is not recommended anyway. However, I have tested Ace Combat 5.0 as well as Ace Combat 4 with the speed hacks disabled, and I've noticed that the gameplay runs pretty much the same. I haven't noticed any improvement or lack of improvement with speed hacks enabled or disabled. Now, I enable them just in case there is any improvement in Ace Combat, but I haven't personally noticed any improvement or an improvement otherwise. In game fixes, there's only one thing here that I ever check off, and that's switch to GSDX software rendering when an FMV plays. So, the hardware rendering of cutscenes in Ace Combat tend to look rather pixelated. So what this does is it switches the renderer to software mode when playing cutscenes, which tend to look the edges look a little softer in software mode as opposed to hardware mode. You don't get as much pixelated effect. It might make things look a little blurry, but in the end, I do enjoy the softer edges that come with it. So it's really up to you. Go with whichever method you prefer. And with that out of the way, I will now go into my main video settings. Like I said before, if you are an AMD user, you should use the settings recommended by Tuga Avenger, because what I'm going to be using here is OpenGL. And OpenGL has some compatibility issues with AMD cards. It doesn't seem to run as well. You get slowed down, apparently. I can't verify this myself, as I am not an AMD user. I've never used an AMD card. But one thing I have noticed is that OpenGL is the best renderer for Ace Combat 5 and 0. I have tested both Direct 3D 11 as well as OpenGL, and OpenGL is just the best. It renders more elements in game as well as out of game in the menus, I mean. So, for example, in Ace Combat 0, if you were playing Ace Combat 0 with Direct 3D 11 instead, you're going to find that certain menu elements are missing. You get like black menus in Ace Combat 0, and it just looks really bad. As well as certain in-game effects are just either straight up missing or are rendered so softly that you barely notice them. For example, the heat wave on your afterburners uh, don't render in direct 3D11, or if they are there, you can barely see them. It tends to be a lot more noticeable in OpenGL. You can see those elements a lot more effectively, as well as some other weather effects. But that just comes with a couple of hacks that are only really available in OpenGL. So let's go over those. But before I do that, let's see. I've got interlacing set to Bob TFF. You can choose either Bob TFF or Auto. These are the two best settings, Bob TFF and Auto for Ace Combat. In Auto, it completely eliminates all possible shaking you might get when playing this game. I like to use Bob TFF, however, because it tends to look a bit smoother in game. Unfortunately, you do get some shaking in the menus and the cutscenes, but I play Ace Combat mainly for the gameplay, so I use Bob TFF for the smoother frame rates. Texture filtering I've set to bilinear, forced excluding sprite. It just looks the best, in my personal opinion. Internal resolution I've set to 4x native. And you set this to whichever setting you prefer. If you've got a good enough card, you can set this to higher settings if you choose. 4 seems to be the happy zone for me. I've turned off anisotropic filtering. I haven't noticed any visual improvement with anisotropic filtering turned on and turned off. There's really no difference. So I turned it off, and I've activated allow 8-bit textures just for the slightly improved frame rate, if there is any. MIP mapping I've set to basic. You need MIP mapping in order to avoid ground texture glitches that might occur in the game. And lastly, I've got the CRC hack level set to partial. OpenGL recommends this, so might as well set it to that. You can actually turn the setting off completely, and your game will work just fine as well. It's again, much like the speed hacks from the main settings, it's one that you can go with or without. It really doesn't seem to improve anything. I've enabled hardware hacks, of course, and I'll go into my settings in a minute. I've also enabled accurate date, which does help, I guess, more accurate algorithm to compute GS destination alpha testing. I don't know what that really means, and I haven't noticed much difference with it on or off, but I assume it helps. Crud, my phone's going off here. Let me give it a minute just before it, see if it turns off quickly. Okay, I guess that stopped. Good. Sorry about that, folks. That was my landline, so unfortunately I couldn't quite cancel it. I was going to get into blending unit accuracy. So blending unit accuracy also affects the heat wave on your afterburners, and maybe a couple other effects in game. I haven't noticed anything other than the effect it has on the heat wave on your afterburners. If you turn this off completely, you won't notice the afterburner heat wave as much. If you set it to medium, high, or full, you're really going to notice it. It seems to extend the distance of the heat wave, so to speak. Leave it at basic. Even if you've got a high-end rig, it doesn't really improve that much. And just as far as space goes, basic looks just fine. You can see the heat wave very pronouncedly. But now let's get into my advanced settings and hacks. So of course I've checked line sprite. You need that to avoid the black vertical lines that happen when using hardware mode. Fast texture invalidation, you can turn this off or not use it if you so choose. I have this activated because, I don't know, for all I know, it could be a placebo effect, but I feel like it improves my frame rate a little bit with it on. It doesn't hurt at any rate, so you might as well turn it on. Unscaled point line. Okay, this is a big one. So when using higher than native resolutions for Ace combats, certain elements begin to disappear. For example, the clouds, they're going to disappear, and even with unscaled point line checked, you're not going to see the clouds. But you also miss other elements. Your HUD, the lines in your HUD become thin and barely noticeable for some people. Certain weather effects like rain, you can't see raindrops, and you won't be able to notice the navigation lights on your wingmen's wingtips. You can see them on your own aircraft, but at a distance, you can't see your wingmen's wingtips. So what unscaled point line does is it fixes that. You can see the with it checked, your HUD elements the lines will become thicker. You'll be able to see your HUD more clearly. And the wingtips on your wingman's aircraft, the lights will be very visible even at farther distance. In addition, you'll be able to see raindrops flying past your canopy. You'll be able to see tracer rounds coming out of either your allies' aircraft or your opponent's aircraft. As well as any surface fire that might be taking place. So if you've got tanks, you'll be able to see tanks firing upon each other. You'll see the tracer rounds coming out with unscaled point line checked. The other thing unscaled point line fixes are the lights on the deck of the carrier Kestrel. So you know that little in-game cutscene where you take off from the Kestrel and you see all the crew moving about doing their business. You'll be able to see the lights on the Kestrel with unscaled point line check. So this really does improve a lot improve the game with this check. The only problem with unscaled point line is some of the border edges around the boxes of your menu items, as well as some of your HUD elements, will become a little skewed. They might extend farther than they should. It's not really noticeable, and the trade-off is so much better. Being able to see more elements of your game is always great. Being able to see rain is great. Being able to see the warning and navigation lights on your allied aircraft is great. So, it's definitely worth checking. And it doesn't seem to hurt your frame rate. So, and I think it might also be offered in GSDX11. So, if you use 3D11, you can probably use this as well, and I recommend it. Now, to fix the ghosting issues that happen with Ace Combat, ghosting, for those of you who don't know, is when your aircraft produces a double image. So, for example, in Ace Combat 5, if you play on missions with a lot of fog or rain, you're going to get a double image on your aircraft, and it kind of makes things look really blurry. There were a couple ways to fix that. The first way was by using the Wild Arms offset. And again, if you're an AMD user, you're going to want to use this method instead. You're going to want to use Wild Arms offset, probably. Although, I think the upgraded half-pixel offset is offered now for AMD users. I mean, is offered with the 3D11 settings, so who knows? Maybe it'll work better for you now. But anyway, the Wild Arms offset would fix the ghosting issue, but it would produce a glitch in the cloud's shadow. So when flying around in Ace Combat, the clouds produce a shadow that you can see on the surface. It looks really cool, but if you use Wild Arms offset, it'll glitch them, and they will change shape and texture, and they will change position rapidly, and it's a little distracting when flying around in your aircraft. So with these settings, however, I don't have to use Wild Arms offset. The half-pixel offset has its own fix, which is special texture aggressive, and I recommend you use that. This will fix the ghosting, and plus you won't have to deal with the shadow texture glitch that occurs with the Wild Arms offset. Sprite I've set to off. round sprite I've set to half. You want to set this to half so that you can actually see the afterburners on your aircraft. It really affects that. But also, it removes the lines in your radar. So in game, if you don't have round sprite set to half, if you turn it off, you're going to get these horizontal lines in your radar as well as your pause menu. So this fixes that. Lastly, I've got geometry shader set to force enabled and image load store set to force enabled. You can set these to auto if you want. I have these enables because, like the description says, it allows the GPU instead of just the CPU to transform lines into sprites. This reduces the CPU load and the bandwidth requirements, but is heavier on the GPU. So basically, if you have a weaker GPU, if you've got like a 780 or below, I'd recommend probably disabling these, force disabled for both of these options. But just so you're aware, if you disable both of them, I think it will negatively impact unscaled point line. You won't be able to see your rain elements or the navigation lights if you disable both of these. So I have them both enabled. And I think that about covers my settings. Oh, shader. Okay. This texture filtering of display is automatically going to be enabled when you start up PCSX2 for the first time. Leave it enabled. If you disable this, it's going to make everything in-game look really pixelated, especially if you play in software mode. So just leave that enabled. It looks fine the way it is. I've also, of course, enabled FXAA shader. Makes everything look a little less blocky, which is nice. On-screen display configuration, I have unchecked. I think it had enable log here. I unchecked that. It's a little bit distracting because when you enable it, when you save your game, it shows a little description that says saving game or something. It's like, I don't need it. So I disabled that. And I think that about covers it. I would show you some in-game footage. Unfortunately, when I first practiced this tutorial myself, the in-game sound came back completely garbled. It sounded awful. So I won't be showing you any gameplay footage. But again, these settings are the best for Ace Combat 0 and Ace Combat 5. And again, I definitely, above all else, I recommend you use the OpenGL hardware renderer for Ace Combat. You're going to get the most accurate emulation with it, as opposed to using the direct 3D11. One other thing I guess I might as well go over, because I've never seen anybody else go over it, is the enable widescreen patches. So, Ace Combat has its own set of in-game widescreen enablement, but it looks awful. So there is actually a file that comes with every version of PCSX. Do I have it? Oh, I think I might have deleted it. 1 second. Let me go into my recycle bin. Okay, let's restore that. So this file right here, excuse me, this file. No. Where? What? Oh God, no. Oh, phew. What did I just do? Okay. Don't do that. Whatever I just did, don't do it. There we go. This file is going to come with every version of PCSX that you download. This is the widescreen patches for the game. Or it comes with a lot of different widescreen patches for a lot of different games, but Ace Combat 4, 5, and 0 are amongst them. So what you want to do is move this file to widescreen, to cheats here. I'm just going to quickly delete all these. These aren't going to be in your file originally, unless you've already done this before. But this should be empty if you're doing this for the very first time. Why isn't this deleting? Yes. Wow, it's not deleting them all. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is I want to extract this folder into this. Extract here. You're not going to get this option. I'm just going to say yes to all. I'm replacing all these files. And there we go. All of the files have been extracted. All these files here are different widescreen patches to a vast variety of different emulated PS2 games, including Ace Combat. You can leave them all as is. I wouldn't recommend going searching for Ace Combat. So the specific Ace Combat files in here, so to speak, but they are amongst them. After that is done, just make sure you have enable widescreen patches enabled, and you'll be able to play the game with, I guess you could say, a proper widescreen effect. Now, unfortunately, this widescreen, while looking good on practically all aircraft, does have a few problems of its own. For example, if you play with the F4 Phantom or the MiG-21B Fishbed, if you play in cockpit view, which I like to do a lot, you won't be able to see certain elements inside your canopy. It's hard for me to describe exactly, but I'll include a picture in the description on basically detailing what I mean. Certain elements will be missing. That's all I can really describe it as. I've gotten in touch with the the creator of the patches, Nemesis 2000, I think is his name, and I think he's looking for a solution for me. So if he does find something that fixes that, I'll be sure to let you all know, but in the meantime, just so you are aware, again, certain cockpit view elements for certain aircraft are going to be missing, or you'll be seeing through them, to be more precise. And that covers it. I hope that you found these settings useful, and always have fun with your games.